Welcome to my channel on the best of fantasy. Well, 2022 is just about over. In fact, for many of you, it probably is already. But it is an opportunity now for me to reflect on my favorite reads, my top reads of 2022, because you all need to watch another top reads of 2022 video on BookTube, don't you? Well, anyway, here is my offering, and I do have a few rules, including no rereads. So, for example, I won't be talking about The Crippled God, which was in fact my favorite read of the year, but it was a reread for me, so it is not on this list. Another rule is that I will only be including one book per author. And it, of course, is a book that I have read in 2022. And this is not ranked. I am not ranking these in any way. I'm presenting them in the order that I read them throughout the year, so chronologically. And I don't give myself a set number of books that I must have on this list. In other words, it's not a top 10 list. It is a books that moved me the most list during 2022. It is when I consider which books to include in this end of the year video, I'm basically thinking about the books that had the biggest impact on me, the books that absolutely spoke to me in some way that was powerful and compelling and perhaps unique. So without further ado, let us talk about the books that I found the most moving and compelling and wonderful during what was a wonderful year overall, 2022. And this is a wonderful way of saying goodbye to the year with much enthusiasm for the year to come. Beginning with The Price of Spring, I have the omnibus edition here, which is labeled The Price of War, but the fourth book in the Long Price Quartet is The Price of Spring. And I must say, this was a book that absolutely moved me to tears. It is the fruition of a 4-book series in which Daniel Abraham does a superb job of making you feel like you have lived a life alongside the characters. When you get to The Price of Spring, the payoff is just tremendous. And the series, I will admit, starts off a bit slow. It is a, as they say, slow burn. But the payoff from that investment early on is just tremendous. Daniel Abraham gets people. He understands human psychology. He knows about conflict. He knows about how our contradictory desires can sometimes prompt us to make some very foolish decisions, certainly foolish in hindsight. There's just so much beauty and depth to his character portrayals in this series, The Long Price Quartet, that I was blown away. And I felt like they were real people. People I knew in my life, could scold and praise and interact with and love. And it was just such a wonderful read. And I also had a great time talking with some of my friends about this series. But just a read that I will certainly come back to someday. And that's typical of the books that appear on this list. These are books that I most certainly will want to return to and reread, and that is the value of the great reads that speak to us, right? That we can experience them again and again, each time a little differently. I'm sure that if I were to reread The Long Price Quartet, I would get even more out of it. That's just how confident I am in that series. The next one on my list is The Hunger of the Gods by John Gwynne, and this is book 2 in the Bloodsworn trilogy. It is a trilogy that speaks to my Nordic heart. It has a lot of wonderful influence from the Icelandic sagas and from Norse mythology. And Gwyn is just somebody who, he's a kindred spirit, I think, for me. He and I clearly love a lot of the same things, including the influences that just are permeating this series so far, the Bloodsworn trilogy. And for me, The Hunger of the Gods was evidence that John Gwynne is getting better and better and better as a writer. His craft in this book just blew me away. There are sections, especially in the beginning. In the beginning, passages here, I was like, wow, okay, this is really powerful stuff. And Gwyn is unafraid to do things to beloved characters that will have you on the edge of your seat. Well, I'm lying down while I read, but you know what I mean. That will have you absolutely just heart pounding, and you just don't know. You don't know with a Gwyn character who's going to make it and who's not. And that is part of the investment. But with every Gwyn book, what I always have loved is the amount of heart in here. As much as there is pain and suffering and violence and just really tough stuff going on in the world that he portrays, there always are people. Your found family, your friends, those you come together with, and you together make sense of the world. Together you protect one another. You provide a space of safety and warmth and meaning in the company of such people. And that is something that Gwyn does as well as anybody out there. And he's just so good at that. So I loved this book, and I am so excited for the third book of the Bloodsworn Trilogy. And wow, this is an end of a series that I have just tremendously enjoyed. I couldn't include The Crippled God because it was a reread by Steven Erikson, but I do get to include Ian C. Esselmont's Assail, Book 6 of Novels of the Malazan Empire. What a tremendous series in and of itself. I mean, it's true that the Malazan Book of the Fallen tends to get the bulk of the attention from Malazan fans, but Esselmont is a gifted writer who belongs in the conversation about the greatest modern fantasy writers. Esselmont can produce atmosphere like no one else. Right from the beginning of almost every one of his books, he hooks me with his tremendous ability to give me chills thinking about the epicness of the setting, the landscape that I am thrown into from the very beginning of these stories. I mean, he is just so brilliant at it. And he has really done a tremendous job here of fleshing out certain aspects of the Malazan world. This is a continent that Steven Erikson doesn't go to in any of his books. And Esselmont gives us a very vivid, very powerful picture of not only this continent, but its relationship with the rest of the Malazan world in here. Plus, again, there's some nice Old English kind of influences in here as well, so I really enjoyed that. And some revelations for you Malazan fans. If you haven't read Esselmont's material and you don't know what's inside them, there are a lot of things there that will answer many questions, and including in Assail. I mean, there was a particular reveal in here that I was a bit proud because I had sort of called it earlier when I was reading Novels of the Malazan Empire. I think it was Return of the Crimson Guard, when I had made a particular observation about the Crimson Guard, and I turned out to be right, but I didn't know it until Assail, so I was like, yes, I got something right. And so that did increase my enjoyment slightly, but I would have loved the book anyway. Just a tremendous read. Esselmont is so talented and so much fun to read Malazan, by any Malazan book, by either author. Just love this world. It is my, put them all together, and it is my favorite fantasy world / series of all time. I just love both authors, and each contributes something of his own to that world. Next on my list, now this was a little bit tough for me to figure out because I'm only including one book per author, and I read 2 books by Jenny Wirtz this year, and one was the standalone book To Ride Hell's Chasm, which I loved. It could have been in this video, easily. But I also read book 1 of The Wars of Light and Shadow, Curse of the Mistwraith. And I have to say, this feels like the beginning of something tremendous. Maybe, and I strongly suspect that when it's all said and done, Wars of Light and Shadow will be among my very favorite series of all time. Because I was so blown away by Jenny Wirtz's ability to steep me in this world, something that she accomplishes through her unique and timeless prose. And in creating Erathon, I believe that this is going to be one of my favorite characters of all time. These are characters with depth, with life, with tragic circumstances, with conflict, with everything that you could want in an engaging story. And I found myself absolutely gripped. In fact, the last 150 pages or so of Curse of the Mistwraith, I will never forget reading those pages. I mean, there is some visceral stuff. And we're used to our fantasies coming to these raging conclusions in the last couple hundred pages. But there is something just on a different level about the ending of Curse of the Mistwraith that I found so compelling, and it will stick with me, absolutely. So I am so excited to continue reading in the Wars of Light and Shadow in 2023, and hopefully we'll progress significantly in that series. And there is a read-along that will be happening. It has been postponed, but it will be happening eventually, and I will be making announcements about that. Next on my list, something different. I tried for the first time in my life a manga and absolutely adored the experience. I read Vinland Saga, and this was picked for me by Murphy Napier, and I had the privilege of discussing the series with her. And it's just so tremendous to see a manga creator like Makoto Yukimura steeping himself in Icelandic sagas. I guess I'm repeating myself a little bit here with the Icelandic Norse and Old English stuff. So yes, I have my biases, obviously, but he's also just a great storyteller. If he had chosen some other period in history, I have no doubt that Yukimura would have done a tremendous job with the story. This series is steeped in symbolism, in vivid, rich characters, wonderful art, and most of all, a compelling exploration of themes such as pacifism and violence, masculinity, and father and son relationships. And he later gets into the roles of women and gender roles in general. And I mean, you can just tell that Yukimura wanted to explore these themes in the course of the storytelling, which is also very action-packed. I mean, it is there's a lot of violence, and there's a fair dose of humor in here as well. So it's got a lot going for it. And I was extremely impressed by my first foray into manga, and I am looking forward to reading some more manga in 2023. Next on my list, I have a self-published book. And that is really, I think, a tremendous accomplishment for a self-published author to produce a work of such quality is absolutely something that I think is deeply impressive. And I'm talking about The Sundering Sun by Von Roycroft. This is the first book in the Sundered Nation trilogy, and it absolutely knocked my socks off. Now again, I tend to love somewhat historically anchored fantasy, and this one is anchored in the time of the Goths. Okay, so end of the Roman Empire in Western Europe, and the invasion of the Germanic peoples somewhere roughly in that time period. It is a fantasy world though, and there are elements of it that are just straight out of Roycroft's imagination. And then there are things that he has clearly nodded to history for, such as the Goth-like tribes that exist in the story, and to some degree the Amazonian tribe as well that we meet in here. But once again, you know, historical influences aside, which I love, he's also done some tremendous character work in here. And the relationships between the characters, beautifully done. There are just some wonderful pieces of conflict in this story that will grip you. And the action in here is just excellent. One of the best duels I've ever seen, I've ever read, is in this book. And a tremendous amount of investment as a result of the ordeals that the characters go through and the extent to which you find yourself pulling for them. I am absolutely looking forward to the second book in this series, which I most certainly will be reading and covering on the channel. And next on my list, a fairly recent read, and this is part of the Prince of Nothing trilogy. I chose book 2. I knew that R. Scott Baker was going to make this list. He is just too talented not to make this list when I'm reading his stuff for the first time this year. In the Prince of Nothing trilogy, I have just about finished the 3rd book and was waiting to make this video in case the 3rd book, The Thousandfold Thought, might make the list. But I do believe that The Warrior Prophet is going to edge The Thousandfold Thought for me. I am, as I said, deeply impressed by R. Scott Baker's writing. Very thoughtful series so far. And of course, the Prince of Nothing trilogy is the beginning of the Second Apocalypse series, which I will eventually read the entirety of. However, I am going to give myself a little break after reading the Prince of Nothing trilogy, and it's primarily because it is a very bleak world we're getting here. This is a very bleak world that R. Scott Baker is portraying. His view of humanity, or at least the view of, let's say, the view of humanity that he presents in this story is a bit pessimistic, let's put it that way. He tends to emphasize, and it almost is not fair to animals to say it this way, but the animal side of us, the primitive side of us, the side that is kind of selfish and violent, and there's a lot of despair in these books. So you might be wondering, well, gee, what did you get from it? Well, Baker is just such a brilliant and brutally honest writer, and that is something I deeply respect. And if he wants to tell a story where he is pulling away all my delusions, well, that's something I have to admire. And, sometimes I want to read a story that makes me feel good. And sometimes I want to read a story that puts a mirror in front of me, and maybe it's not the prettiest mirror. But it is something that gets me thinking about human nature, about whether there's hope for us or not, about whether we have any free will. And I don't think Baker, at least in these stories, there's not a ton of free will, if any. And that is just part of the exploration that he's doing of human nature. So if you're up for a very brutal read, very bleak, and with a lot of sexual violence, if that stuff is something that you feel like you can get through, then I can recommend the Prince of Nothing trilogy as a very just brilliantly written, vivid series. I don't know if that it would ever make my favorites. Yes, I'm blown away by Baker's writing. I think this is something I'm very glad to have read. I tend to like a little bit of hope in my fiction. I tend to like more beauty than is present. And I'm a fan of series that do contain a lot of suffering. Malazan comes to mind. There's a lot of suffering in Malazan, but that suffering is, in my opinion, balanced by the exploration of compassion. I'm a fan of Joe Abercrombie, First Law. I mean, that is bleak and grimdark as you can get. But there's humor in First Law that makes it all somehow bearable and makes me love the characters, even though they are not just flawed, but horrible. In the case of Baker's books, it just feels like everybody is either an oppressor or a broken person, one or the other, and then there's not a lot of in between there. And it's hard to feel myself loving these characters. Maybe pity sometimes, maybe horror, disgust, revulsion, fascination, but I don't feel like I love any of the characters in this series. My utmost respect to Baker, but I just don't know if I'm the ideal person for the Second Apocalypse. But I recognize his genius, and that is the right word in this case. He is a genius. Brilliant stuff. So very glad to have read it, and it certainly deserves to be on this list. The Warrior Prophet being my favorite of the trilogy. And now for something completely different. Stephen King's The Dark Tower. This is book 7 of the series of the same name, The Dark Tower. I cannot say enough about the end of this journey. And I had been warned many a time by Dark Tower readers that there is a split somewhere around, Wolves of the Kala, Song of Susanna, where a lot of readers were upset about a particular aspect, a meta aspect of the series. I loved it. I had no issue with it whatsoever. I had a brilliant time. I cried in book 7 a lot, and I feel like it was the fruition, once again, of a lot of the stuff that had come before, some of the beautiful character work, the relationships, just a lot going for this series that had me, took my breath away in places. And King just goes for it. He goes for the weird. He goes for the bizarre. He goes for the vast and the epic. He just goes for it. And he is not afraid to portray humanity in its most awkward, glorious way. I mean, it's just, we are incredibly flawed and lovable, and he captures all of it there, with the quartet especially, and in the iconic character of Roland. I mean, I came to love Roland when I read the 4th book, Wizard and Glass, and I never stopped loving him, but it was the 7th book that really, I think, made me feel so connected not only to him, but to the rest of the quartet. Just fantastic stuff. And I love where King went with this. I love the whole concept of the Dark Tower. I love the idea of the quest. And I love the idea of the people we meet along that quest being something of vital importance, the relationships that we form. I mean, this series is just an incredible thing, a crazy mix of fantasy and horror and sci-fi and Western and what have you. But it's about us, fundamentally. It's about people, and it's about the journey of life and what makes meaning in that journey. And I think King captures some really beautiful truths in the process. So that's definitely, I mean, Dark Tower is going to be firmly in my top 10 series of all time. And I don't see anything moving it away from there. Yeah. And the last book on this list, most recently read, is Holy Sister by Mark Lawrence. This is the 3rd book in the Book of the Ancestor trilogy. I loved this trilogy. It is my favorite trilogy by Mark Lawrence so far. I read Broken Empire, I read Red Queen's War, and now I've read Book of the Ancestor, and I love these characters. I love Nona Gray. I love her friends. I love the Convent of Sweet Mercy and this whole world. There were times when I was reading it, particularly in the 3rd book, in Holy Sister. This world, this dying world, it gave me chills, the scenes that Mark Lawrence set here. It's a bit like when Tolkien in the Silmarillion has a giant wave wipe out an entire civilization. There's this sense of awe and horror, but also this sense of, I guess as the reader, you're just sitting there, in my case, in my bed, lying there, and you get chills because somehow you're seeing this epic thing play out, and it's frightening. But you're in your bed, and you're cozy, and you're okay, and somehow there's a fascination to that. And Lawrence really captures that. Plus, he gives us some just beautiful characters and some just lovely relationships in here. The friendship theme, that Mark Lawrence does friendship as well as anyone. And I found myself so moved to tears as I read the conclusion to this trilogy and the characters that I'd come to love along the way. Because what Lawrence does is he creates a sense of connection, a sense of empathy with these characters because they are flawed, they are broken, they have their faults. And somehow that makes them all the more dear, all the more vivid and lovable. And I just could not put these books down. I mean, Lawrence just hits the right spot for me every time, where I feel like I'm being challenged intellectually, but I'm being entertained simultaneously. And they fly by. I mean, he's just a talented author. So I am so glad to have another trilogy of his under my belt, and I'm looking forward to the next one. That's it for me, guys. Those are my top 9. It turned out to be 9 this year. Top 9 reads of 2022. And I am so excited to see what's coming in 2023. Lots of great things happening. And I hope to hear from you about those reads that I will be delving into in 2023. I'd love to hear your comments on any of these if you've read them or if you're thinking about reading them in the comments. I love your comments. And that is it from me for now. Until next year.